At dinner, my son said loudly, "At least Mom's new husband isn't a loser like you." I said nothing. The next morning, his car was gone and his school account was frozen. That evening, my ex called me in a panic. I, 42M, never thought my own son would be the one to deliver the final blow, but life has a way of surprising you in the cruelest ways possible. The divorce had been finalized 8 months ago, and the custody arrangement gave my ex-wife primary custody while I got weekends and holidays. What hurt most wasn't losing my marriage of 15 years. That ship had sailed long before the papers were signed, but watching my 16-year-old son drift further away from me each passing week. Last Friday evening started like any other weekend visit. I'd picked him up from his mother's house, that pristine suburban palace she now shared with her new husband, a corporate lawyer who drove a BMW and wore suits that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The contrast between their marble countertops and my modest apartment wasn't lost on anyone, especially not my son. We'd gone to his favorite steakhouse, the same place we'd been coming to since he was 8 years old. I thought maybe the familiar setting would help us connect, like old times. I was wrong. He spent most of dinner scrolling through his phone, barely touching the expensive steak I'd ordered for him. When I asked about school, his responses were monosyllabic. When I mentioned the baseball game we'd planned for Saturday, he just shrugged. The silence between us felt suffocating. Then, as I was paying the check, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, he looked up from his phone with eyes that held nothing but contempt. What he said next would replay in my mind for hours afterward. He told me, loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, that at least his mom's new husband wasn't a loser like me. He said his stepfather had already accomplished more at 38 than I ever would. He mentioned the new car his stepfather had bought him, the college fund that was already set up, the vacation to Europe they were planning. The restaurant seemed to fall silent around us. I felt every pair of eyes in that place turning our way, witnessing my humiliation. My hands trembled slightly as I signed the credit card receipt, but I said nothing. Not a single word. The drive back to my apartment was excruciating. He put his earbuds in and stared out the window, completely shutting me out. When we arrived, he went straight to the guest room and closed the door. I sat in my living room until well past midnight, staring at the wall and feeling something inside me fundamentally shift. I'd spent 8 months walking on eggshells, trying to be the understanding father, the bigger person. I'd swallowed my pride when my ex flaunted her new relationship. I'd smiled and nodded when she made scheduling changes that cut into my time with our son. I'd even congratulated her when she announced their engagement, thinking it was best for everyone involved. But my son's words that night weren't just teenage rebellion or misplaced anger about the divorce. They were calculated cruelty, delivered with surgical precision to wound me where it would hurt most. And in that moment, sitting alone in my dark apartment, I realized I was done being the victim in my own life. Saturday morning, I woke up with absolute clarity about what needed to happen. My son was still asleep when I quietly retrieved his car keys from his jacket pocket. The silver sedan his stepfather had bought him sat in my parking space, gleaming in the morning sun. I'd never liked that car, not because it was expensive, but because of what it represented. It was a symbol of how easily I'd been replaced, how quickly my role as provider and father figure had been usurped. I drove the car to my ex-wife's house and parked it in their driveway, leaving the keys on the front seat with the doors unlocked. If they wanted to play games about who the better provider was, they could take full responsibility for their generous gifts. But the car was just the beginning. Back home, I opened my laptop and logged into the account I'd set up for my son's school expenses. During the divorce proceedings, I'd agreed to maintain sole responsibility for his tuition, books, and school-related costs. It was one of the few things I'd fought for, wanting to maintain that connection to his education and future. The balance showed nearly $8,000, money I'd been saving for his senior year expenses, college application fees, and graduation costs. With a few clicks, I transferred every penny into my personal savings account and then closed the school account entirely. My phone started buzzing around noon. Text messages from my son, asking where his car was. I deleted them without responding. More messages came throughout the day, his tone shifting from confusion to anger to something approaching panic. I deleted those too. That evening, as I was heating up leftover pizza and trying to focus on a baseball game, my ex-wife called. Her voice was tight with barely controlled hysteria as she demanded to know what I'd done with the car. She insisted I was being childish and that I was only hurting our son. I listened to her rant for about 30 seconds before calmly explaining that the car had been returned to its rightful home. I told her that since her new husband was such a successful provider, surely he could handle the responsibility of the vehicle he'd purchased. As for the school account, I informed her that effective immediately, I would no longer be covering any educational expenses. She tried to argue, reminding me of our divorce agreement, but I cut her off. I explained that our son had made it very clear the previous evening that he preferred his stepfather's financial support. I was simply honoring his wishes by stepping aside and letting his new father figure take over completely. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly a minute. When she finally spoke again, her voice had lost all its earlier bravado. She asked me what I wanted, what it would take to fix this situation. I told her the truth. I didn't want anything anymore. For 8 months, I tried to maintain a relationship with a son who clearly had no respect for me and an ex-wife who seemed determined to erase me from their lives. I was tired of fighting for scraps of affection and acknowledgement. She started crying then, saying I was being cruel and vindictive. She claimed our son didn't mean what he'd said, that he was just confused and angry about the divorce. But I'd heard the conviction in his voice the night before. Those weren't the words of a confused teenager. They were the carefully chosen weapons of someone who knew exactly how to inflict maximum damage. The conversation ended with her threatening to take me to court, to force me to uphold my financial obligations. I wished her luck with that, and hung up. Update 1. The next few days were surprisingly peaceful. My phone continued to buzz with increasingly desperate messages from both my ex and my son, but I ignored them all. There's something liberating about finally accepting that some relationships are beyond repair. Wednesday afternoon, I got a call from my son's school. The administration was concerned about the closed account and the outstanding balance for his senior year activities. I politely explained that there had been a change in financial responsibility and directed them to contact his mother for payment arrangements. That evening, my ex showed up at my apartment. She looked exhausted, her usually perfect makeup slightly smudged, her designer clothes wrinkled. She asked if we could talk, and despite my better judgment, I let her in. She sat on my couch, the same couch she'd dismissed as shabby during our marriage, and tried to explain our son's behavior. She claimed he'd been acting out because he was struggling with the divorce more than he let on. She said he'd been seeing a therapist, and that his outburst at dinner was just misdirected anger. I listened without interrupting, watching her try to construct a narrative that would absolve everyone of responsibility except me. According to her version of events, I was the adult who should have been more understanding, more patient, more willing to absorb abuse in the name of family harmony. When she finished her rehearsed speech, I asked her a simple question. If our son was so troubled by the divorce, why had she encouraged his disrespectful behavior for months? Why had she allowed him to skip visits, ignore my calls, and treat me like an unwelcome stranger in his life? She couldn't answer that. Instead, she shifted tactics, appealing to my sense of duty as a father. She reminded me that regardless of what had happened between us, our son shouldn't suffer financially because of it. She was right, of course, but she was also missing the point entirely. I explained to her that our son had made his choice very publicly and very clearly. He'd chosen his stepfather as his role model and provider. I was simply respecting that decision by removing myself from the equation. If she wanted me to resume financial responsibility, our son would need to demonstrate genuine respect and remorse, not just apologize because his car and college fund had disappeared. She left that night without getting the commitment she'd come for, but something in her expression told me this wasn't over. Update 2. The breakthrough came the following weekend, in the most unexpected way. I was grocery shopping when I ran into my son's best friend at the store. The kid had always liked me, and unlike my son, he still made eye contact when we spoke. He looked uncomfortable when he saw me, shifting his weight from foot to foot like he had something important to say. Finally, he worked up the courage to tell me that he thought what my son had said at dinner was really messed up. But then he shared something that changed everything. He'd been there the day my ex-wife's new husband had coached my son on what to say. According to his friend, the stepfather had been building up to this moment for weeks, making comments about how I was holding them back financially, how my modest lifestyle was embarrassing, how a real man would have provided better for his family. The night before our dinner, he'd apparently told my son that it was time to make me understand where I stood in the family hierarchy. The whole thing had been orchestrated. The timing, the public setting, even some of the specific phrases my son had used, it had all been planned to inflict maximum humiliation and push me to the breaking point. I thanked the kid for telling me and went home with my groceries, feeling a mixture of vindication and heartbreak. My son hadn't just lashed out in teenage anger. He'd been manipulated into becoming a weapon in his stepfather's campaign to completely eliminate me from their lives. That night, I called my lawyer. Update 3. The legal consultation confirmed what I'd suspected. My ex-wife and her new husband had been playing a dangerous game. By encouraging our son to disrespect me and attempting to alienate him from our relationship, they'd potentially violated several aspects of our custody agreement. More importantly, the stepfather's coaching session created grounds for a parental alienation claim. If I could prove that my son's behavior had been systematically encouraged and orchestrated, I could potentially seek modification of the custody arrangement and financial responsibilities. But as I sat in the lawyer's office, reviewing documents and discussing strategy, I realized something important. I didn't want to fight this battle in court. I was tired of being the battlefield in someone else's war for control. Instead, I made a different choice. I wrote a letter, not to my ex-wife or her husband, but to my son. In it, I explained everything I'd learned about the manipulation and coaching. I told him that while I was disappointed in his choices, I understood that he'd been put in an impossible position by adults who should have protected him from their conflicts. I also explained the consequences of his actions. His car was gone because he'd made it clear he preferred his stepfather's gifts. His school account was closed because he'd publicly rejected my role as his provider. These weren't punishments born from anger, but natural consequences of the choices he'd made and the words he'd spoken. But I also left the door open. I told him that if he ever wanted a genuine relationship with his father, not based on money or material things, but on mutual respect and honest communication, I would be willing to work toward that. However, it would require him to take responsibility for his actions and demonstrate that he valued me as more than just a source of financial support. I mailed the letter on a Friday and waited. The response came the following Tuesday, not from my son, but from my ex-wife. She was furious that I'd poisoned our son's mind against his stepfather. She demanded that I stop spreading lies and manipulation. But her anger told me everything I needed to know. My son had shown her the letter, which meant he'd read it. And her defensive reaction suggested that everything his friend had told me was true. I didn't respond to her call or her subsequent text messages. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my own life, free from the constant drama and manipulation that had consumed me for months. 3 weeks later, my son called me directly for the first time since that terrible dinner. His voice was quiet, uncertain, as he asked if we could meet somewhere neutral to talk. I agreed to coffee at a small cafe downtown. When I saw him walk through the door, he looked older somehow, like the weight of recent events had forced him to mature faster than he'd planned. We sat across from each other in silence for several minutes before he finally spoke. He apologized, not the scripted, half-hearted apology I'd expected, but something raw and genuine. He admitted that he'd known his words at dinner would hurt me, and that while he'd been coached on what to say, he'd chosen to say them anyway. He acknowledged that he'd been treating me poorly for months and that it wasn't just about the divorce or teenage rebellion. Most importantly, he asked me a question that showed he was finally beginning to understand the situation. He wanted to know how we could fix our relationship without it being about money or what either of his father figures could provide for him. I told him the truth, that rebuilding trust would take time and consistent effort from both of us. I explained that I'd removed the financial support not out of spite, but because he'd made it clear that he valued me only for what I could provide materially. If he wanted a real relationship with his father, it would have to be built on something more substantial than designer clothes and expensive dinners. We talked for 2 hours that day, the longest genuine conversation we'd had in over a year. When we left the cafe, we didn't have everything figured out, but we had something we'd been missing for a long time: honest communication and mutual respect. The financial arrangements remain unchanged. His stepfather can provide the cars and college funds and European vacations. But my son and I are slowly building something that money can't buy. A real relationship based on who we are as people, not what we can do for each other. As for my ex-wife and her husband, They got exactly what they thought they wanted: complete financial responsibility for my son's lifestyle. They also got something they didn't expect: a teenager who now questions their motives and manipulation tactics. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's refusing to play a rigged game and forcing everyone else to face the consequences of their choices. I spent months being the victim in my own story, absorbing abuse and manipulation in the name of keeping peace. But there's a difference between being the bigger person and being a doormat. My son learned that words have consequences, that respect can't be bought, and that real relationships require genuine effort from both parties. My ex-wife learned that her attempts to erase me from our son's life had backfired spectacularly. And her husband learned that coaching a child to humiliate his father isn't the power play he thought it would be. Most importantly, I learned that sometimes walking away from a toxic situation isn't giving up. It's reclaiming your dignity and forcing others to confront the reality of their choices. The car may be gone and the school account may be empty, but my relationship with my son is stronger now than it's been since the divorce. And that's worth more than all the BMWs and European vacations in the world. If you'd like to see more stories like this, a gentle tap on the subscribe button would mean the world to us. Please subscribe.